June 15th, 1946. Saturday, Las Vegas, Nevada. The desert air shimmered with heat and possibility as Virginia Hill stepped out of the black Cadillac onto the dusty ground where the Flamingo Hotel would soon rise like a pink mirage from the Nevada wasteland. At 32, she possessed the kind of beauty that could stop conversations and start wars. But it was her sharp intelligence and ruthless pragmatism that had carried her from the red clay poverty of Alabama to this moment of unprecedented power. She wore a cream-colored silk dress that cost more than most families earned in 6 months, and diamond earrings that caught the harsh desert light like captured stars. Benjamin Siegel stood beside her, his movie star handsome face animated with the fervor of a true believer as he gestured toward the construction site. "This is it, Red," he said, using the nickname that only he was allowed to speak. "This is where we build our empire." His voice carried the confidence of a man who had never met an obstacle he couldn't charm, bribe, or eliminate, and Virginia felt the familiar thrill that came from standing next to someone who dared to dream as big as she did. The Flamingo was more than a hotel. It was a statement of intent, a declaration that the old rules no longer applied in this new world they were creating. Virginia had invested not just her money, but her very identity in this venture, transforming herself from a sharecropper's daughter into the unofficial queen of America's most dangerous underworld. The men who funded this dream, Meyer Lansky, Lucky Luciano, Frank Costello, treated her with a respect that was rare for women in their world. But she understood that respect was conditional, dependent on her continued usefulness and discretion. She thought about the path that had brought her here, a journey that began in the suffocating poverty of Lipscomb, Alabama, where she had watched her mother's beauty fade under the weight of endless childbearing and backbreaking labor. Virginia had sworn then that she would never be trapped by circumstances beyond her control, never be dependent on anyone else's charity or mercy. She had clawed her way up from waitressing in Chicago speakeasies to running numbers for Joe Epstein, learning that information was currency and silence was survival in a world where the wrong word could mean a shallow grave in the desert. The money had come gradually at first, then in torrents that threatened to sweep her away. Envelopes full of cash passed through her manicured hands like water, some destined for politicians who needed convincing, others for judges who required reminding of their obligations. She had become indispensable as a courier and facilitator, the beautiful woman who could charm her way past security guards and suspicious wives, who could remember faces and names and amounts without ever writing anything down. But wealth, Virginia had discovered, was a double-edged sword that cut as deeply as it protected. Every fur coat came with invisible chains. Every diamond necklace was a collar that bound her more tightly to men whose affection could turn lethal without warning. She had seen what happened to women who forgot their place in this hierarchy. They simply disappeared, their names never mentioned again, their fates serving as silent warnings to those who remained. The construction workers moved around them like ants, their hammers and saws creating a symphony of ambition that echoed across the empty desert. Virginia watched them work and felt a strange mixture of pride and foreboding. She had helped design the interior of the Flamingo, choosing fabrics and fixtures with the eye of someone who understood that luxury was theater, that the right atmosphere could make men forget they were being robbed. The casino would be a temple to greed and desperation, decorated with enough glamour to make losing feel like winning. Bugsy took her hand, his fingers warm and strong against hers, and for a moment she allowed herself to believe in the fairy tale they were creating together. They would be the king and queen of Las Vegas, ruling over an empire of neon and sin, wealthy beyond imagination and powerful enough to rewrite the rules that had once confined them. The Flamingo would be their monument, proof that two people from nothing could build something magnificent through sheer force of will and carefully applied violence. Yet even as she smiled and nodded at Bugsy's grand plans, Virginia felt the weight of secrets pressing against her chest like a physical burden. She had been skimming money from the construction funds, small amounts at first but growing bolder as the project's budget spiraled out of control. It wasn't stealing, she told herself. It was insurance, a hedge against the day when the men who owned her might decide she knew too much to live. She had accounts in Switzerland and Mexico, enough money hidden away to disappear if necessary, though she prayed that day would never come. The sun was beginning to set over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that matched the Flamingo's planned color scheme. Virginia stood in the middle of what would soon be the casino floor, surrounded by the skeletal framework of her dreams, and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the desert evening. She had spent her life building walls of wealth and beauty to protect herself from the world's cruelty, but she was beginning to understand that some prisons were made of gold. And the most dangerous cages were the ones you built for yourself. As they walked back to the car, Bugsy's arm around her waist, Virginia caught sight of their reflection in the Cadillac's polished chrome. They looked like movie stars, beautiful and untouchable, the perfect couple for this perfect moment. But reflections, she knew, were just illusions, images that could shatter at the slightest impact. In the distance, a coyote howled at the rising moon, a sound that seemed to carry all the loneliness and danger of the desert night, and Virginia shivered despite the lingering heat, wondering if she had finally climbed too high to survive the inevitable fall. Chapter 2: The Rise and the Initial Struggles. October 3rd, 1946. Thursday. Beverly Hills, California. The mansion on Linden Drive was a testament to the American dream's darker possibilities. Its Spanish colonial architecture and manicured gardens concealing secrets that would have horrified the neighbors who waved politely from their own palatial estates. Virginia Hill stood in the marble-floored foyer, watching as men in expensive suits carried briefcases full of cash through her front door with the casual efficiency of postal workers delivering mail. The house had become a neutral meeting ground for the syndicate's West Coast operations, a place where territorial disputes could be settled over cocktails and canaps rather than bullets and blood. She moved through the rooms with practiced grace, playing hostess to men who controlled entire cities through fear and corruption. Mickey Cohen sat in the living room, his thick Brooklyn accent cutting through the cigarette smoke as he argued with Jack Dragna about territory and percentages. In the study, Meyer Lansky reviewed ledgers with the focused intensity of a scholar, his thin fingers tracing columns of numbers that represented more money than most people could imagine. Virginia served drinks and smiled at their jokes, but her eyes never stopped calculating, measuring the temperature of the room, and watching for the subtle signs that preceded violence. The Flamingo project had become a source of constant tension, its costs spiraling beyond even Bugsy's wildest projections. What had begun as a $6 million investment had ballooned to nearly twice that amount, with no end in sight to the hemorrhaging of funds. Virginia found herself caught between her loyalty to Bugsy and her survival instincts, defending his vision to increasingly skeptical investors while secretly wondering if his ambition had finally exceeded his grasp. She had poured her own money into the project, hundreds of thousands of dollars that represented years of careful accumulation, and the thought of losing it all made her stomach clench with familiar anxiety. Her relationship with Bugsy had grown volatile under the pressure, their passionate love affair now marked by explosive arguments that could shake the windows and passionate reconciliations that left them both exhausted. He accused her of not supporting him enough, of listening too closely to the doubters and critics who questioned his judgment. She accused him of being reckless with money that wasn't his, of making promises he couldn't keep to men who didn't forgive failure. Their fights were operatic in their intensity, fueled by genuine love and mutual desperation, but Virginia had begun to recognize the dangerous edge that crept into Bugsy's voice when he felt cornered. The telephone rang constantly now, calls from New York and Chicago that made Bugsy's face go pale and hard. Virginia would watch him pace the length of the Persian rug in the study, his voice rising and falling as he tried to explain cost overruns and construction delays to men who measured success in dollars and cents rather than dreams and visions. She could hear the impatience in the voices on the other end of the line, the growing suspicion that their golden boy might not be as golden as they had believed. One evening in late October, as rain drummed against the windows and the house felt smaller than usual, Virginia found herself alone with Frank Costello in the library. He was older than the others, more sophisticated, and he had always treated her with a respect that bordered on genuine affection. But tonight, his eyes were cold as he sipped his brandy and studied her face in the lamplight. "You're a smart woman, Virginia," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of unspoken threats. "Smarter than most of the men in this business. So I'm going to ask you a question, and I want you to think carefully before you answer." He paused, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "Is Benjamin stealing from us?" The question hung in the air like smoke, and Virginia felt her heart hammering against her ribs. She had suspected for months that Bugsy was skimming money from the construction funds, taking more than his agreed-upon percentage, and hiding it in accounts she couldn't track. But suspecting and knowing were different things, and accusing the man she loved of betraying his oldest friends was a line she wasn't sure she could cross. "Ben's not a thief," she said finally, meeting Costello's gaze with all the conviction she could muster. "He's a dreamer, maybe too much of one for his own good. But he's not stealing from you." The lie tasted bitter on her tongue, but it was a necessary lie, one that might buy Bugsy enough time to prove his critics wrong. Costello nodded slowly, but his expression didn't soften. "For your sake, I hope you're right," he said, setting down his glass and rising from his chair. "Because if you're wrong, if you're protecting a thief out of misplaced loyalty, then you're going to find yourself in a very dangerous position. We don't just punish the guilty in this business, Virginia. We punish anyone who helps them." After he left, Virginia sat alone in the library, surrounded by leather-bound books she had never read and antique furniture she had never chosen. The house felt like a museum now, beautiful but lifeless, filled with objects that had no meaning beyond their monetary value. She thought about her childhood in Alabama, about the simple honesty of poverty, and wondered when exactly she had traded her soul for silk stockings and diamond bracelets. The next morning brought news that made her blood run cold. The Flamingo's grand opening had been scheduled for December 26th, just 2 months away, despite the fact that the hotel was nowhere near completion. Bugsy had made the announcement to the press without consulting anyone, his trademark confidence masking what Virginia recognized as desperation. He was betting everything on one grand gesture, hoping that a successful opening would silence his critics and prove that his vision had been worth the astronomical cost. But Virginia had been in this world long enough to understand the mathematics of survival. The men who had invested in the Flamingo weren't patient philanthropists. They were businessmen who expected returns on their investments, and they had already waited longer than their nature typically allowed. If the opening was a failure, if the hotel didn't immediately start generating the profits that had been promised, then Bugsy would become a liability that needed to be eliminated. And anyone associated with him, anyone who had defended him or enabled his alleged theft, would be swept away in the same tide of retribution. She walked out to the pool, where the California sun painted everything in shades of gold and blue, and tried to imagine a future that didn't end in violence. But the images wouldn't come. Instead, she saw desert graves and newspaper headlines, saw herself testifying before grand juries or fleeing across international borders with whatever money she could carry. The American dream had become a nightmare, and she was trapped in its golden coils with no clear path to freedom. As evening approached and the first guests began arriving for another of her carefully orchestrated gatherings, Virginia applied her makeup with the precision of a soldier preparing for battle. She would smile and laugh and play the perfect hostess, would defend Bugsy's honor and maintain the facade that everything was proceeding according to plan. But beneath the surface, she was making calculations of her own, weighing loyalty against survival and wondering how much longer she could keep dancing on the edge of a razor blade before it finally cut her throat. Chapter 3: The Major Setback or Crisis. December 26, 1946. Thursday. Las Vegas, Nevada. The Flamingo Hotel's grand opening was supposed to be a coronation, a moment when Benjamin Siegel's desert dream would be vindicated in a blaze of Hollywood glamour and syndicate approval. Instead, it felt like a wake being held in advance of the actual death. Virginia Hill stood in the unfinished lobby, her emerald evening gown a splash of defiant color against the backdrop of exposed wiring and unpainted walls, watching as the most important night of their lives slowly transformed into an unmitigated disaster. The weather had turned vicious, with rain falling in sheets across the desert and winds that made the partially completed structure groan like a living thing in pain. Half of the invited celebrities had canceled at the last minute, citing the storm or sudden illnesses that Virginia knew were diplomatic fiction. Those who did attend moved through the casino with the careful politeness of people attending a funeral for someone they hadn't particularly liked, their smiles brittle and their conversations muted by the obvious signs of the hotel's incomplete state. Bugsy moved through the crowd with manic energy, his charm turned up to maximum intensity as he tried to convince everyone that the rough edges were merely temporary inconveniences. But Virginia could see the desperation in his eyes, the way his hands shook slightly as he lit cigarette after cigarette, the forced quality of his laughter that fooled no one who knew him well. The casino was losing money from the first spin of the roulette wheel, the gaming tables rigged incorrectly or not at all, and the few high rollers who had made the trip were winning far more than they should have been able to. In the VIP section, the men who had funded this venture sat in uncomfortable silence, their faces carved from stone as they watched their investment hemorrhage cash in real time. Meyer Lansky's pale eyes missed nothing, cataloging every mistake and miscalculation with the precision of an accountant preparing an audit. Lucky Luciano sat motionless as a statue, but Virginia could feel the weight of his disapproval radiating across the room like heat from a furnace. These were men who had built their empires on the principle that the house always wins, and watching the house lose so spectacularly was not just disappointing, it was insulting. Virginia tried to play her role as the gracious hostess, moving between tables and ensuring that drinks stayed full and conversations remained civil. But she could feel the foundation of her world shifting beneath her feet, could sense the invisible threads that connected her to power and protection beginning to fray. The other women in the room, the wives and girlfriends of lesser mobsters, watched her with a mixture of pity and schadenfreude, recognizing that her fall from grace would be swift and merciless once the men decided she was no longer useful. By midnight, the disaster was complete. The Flamingo had lost over $300,000 in its first 6 hours of operation, a sum that represented not just financial failure, but a fundamental betrayal of everything the syndicate stood for. Virginia found Bugsy in his office, slumped behind his desk with a half-empty bottle of whiskey and a pile of losing receipts scattered across the mahogany surface. His perfect hair was disheveled, his bow tie undone, and for the first time since she had known him, he looked older than his years. "They're going to kill me," he said without looking up, his voice flat and matter-of-fact. "Not tonight, maybe not tomorrow, but soon. They can't let this kind of failure go unpunished. It would set a precedent that would destroy everything they've built." Virginia wanted to comfort him, to tell him that he was overreacting, that the syndicate would give him another chance to prove himself. But she had been in this world too long to believe in fairy tale endings. She had seen what happened to men who disappointed the bosses, had attended funerals for people whose only crime had been trusting the wrong person or making the wrong bet. Bugsy was right. This wasn't just a business failure, it was a death sentence delivered in the language of profit and loss. "We could run," she said quietly, moving to stand behind his chair. "Take what money we have and disappear. Mexico, South America, somewhere they can't find us." Her hands rested on his shoulders, feeling the tension in his muscles, the weight of impossible choices pressing down on him like a physical burden. He laughed bitterly, finally raising his head to meet her eyes in the mirror across from his desk. "Run where, Red? There's nowhere in the world far enough away from these people. And besides, I'm not a runner. I never have been." His voice carried the stubborn pride that had made him successful and would ultimately destroy him. "I built this place. I'm going to make it work, even if it kills me." The phrase hung in the air between them, prophetic in its casual certainty. Virginia felt a chill that had nothing to do with the desert night, a premonition of loss that made her stomach clench with fear. She had fallen in love with Bugsy's confidence, his absolute certainty that he could bend the world to his will through sheer force of personality. But confidence could become delusion, and the same traits that had made him a legend were now marking him for extinction. Over the following weeks, the situation deteriorated with the inexorable logic of a Greek tragedy. The Flamingo continued to lose money, despite Bugsy's frantic efforts to fix its problems, and the phone calls from New York and Chicago grew shorter and more ominous. Virginia watched helplessly as the walls closed in around them, knowing that every day brought them closer to a reckoning that would leave only one of them standing. The final blow came in the form of an accounting audit that revealed what everyone had already suspected. Millions of dollars were missing from the construction funds. Money that should have gone into the hotel's infrastructure had somehow vanished into a maze of shell companies and offshore accounts. Whether Bugsy had stolen the money himself or simply been careless with bookkeeping didn't matter to the men who had entrusted him with their investment. What mattered was that their money was gone, and someone had to pay for its disappearance. Virginia found herself caught in an impossible position, torn between her love for Bugsy and her instinct for survival. The syndicate's investigators were asking pointed questions about her role in the project, wondering if she had been complicit in the alleged theft or simply a useful idiot who had provided cover for her boyfriend's crimes. Either way, her future was looking increasingly precarious, tied to a man who was rapidly becoming the most wanted fugitive in America's criminal underworld. On a cold February morning in 1947, as she stood in the half-empty casino watching maintenance crews repair slot machines that had been sabotaged by disgruntled creditors, Virginia realized that her fairy tale was ending. The Flamingo would survive. It would eventually become profitable under new management, but she and Bugsy would not be part of its success. They had flown too close to the sun, and now they were falling back to Earth with their wings on fire, leaving only the question of whether they would die together or apart. The desert wind howled through the gaps in the hotel's construction, carrying with it the scent of sage and the promise of violence. Virginia pulled her fur coat tighter around her shoulders and wondered how long she had before the men who had once called her friend decided she knew too much to live. The answer, she suspected, could be measured in days rather than months, and the thought filled her with a terror that all the money in the world couldn't buy away. Chapter 4. The Unraveling. June 20, 1947. Friday. Paris, France. The telephone call came at 3 in the morning, cutting through the silence of Virginia Hill's suite at the Hotel Ritz like a blade through silk. She had been in Paris for 2 weeks, ostensibly shopping for the Flamingo's reopening, but actually putting an ocean between herself and the increasingly dangerous situation in Beverly Hills. The voice on the other end of the line was clipped, professional, devoid of any emotion that might have softened the brutal simplicity of its message. Bugsy's dead. Shot at your house. Don't come back. Virginia set the receiver down with mechanical precision, her hands surprisingly steady despite the earthquake that was reshaping the landscape of her life. She walked to the window and looked out at the city of light, its ancient streets gleaming wet with rain, and tried to process the reality that the man she loved was gone, executed in the living room of the house they had shared, his blood staining the Persian rug she had chosen herself. The distance that had saved her life now felt like abandonment, as if she had somehow known what was coming and fled like a coward rather than standing by his side. The details came in fragments over the following hours, pieced together from newspaper reports and whispered phone calls from associates who spoke in code and hung up quickly. Bugsy had been reading the Los Angeles Times when the shots came through the window, 9 bullets fired with professional precision by someone who knew exactly where he would be sitting. One had struck him in the eye, a detail that would haunt Virginia's dreams for the rest of her life, transforming the face she had kissed into a nightmare of blood and shattered bone. Within hours of the murder, the syndicate had moved with military efficiency to reclaim their assets. The Flamingo was seized by new management, its books audited and its staff replaced with people who understood that the previous regime was not to be mentioned or mourned. Virginia's house on Linden Drive was searched from basement to attic, every safe opened, every hiding place explored, as the organization that had once protected her systematically erased any evidence of her existence from their operations. The newspapers had a field day with the story, transforming Virginia from a private figure into a public spectacle. Headlines screamed about the mob queen and the gangster's mole, accompanied by photographs that made her look either glamorously dangerous or pathetically deluded, depending on the editorial stance of the publication. Reporters camped outside the Ritz, shouting questions in broken English about her relationship with Bugsy and her knowledge of syndicate operations, forcing her to become a prisoner in her own suite. The FBI came calling within a week, their badges and subpoenas carrying the weight of a government that had finally decided to take organized crime seriously. They wanted to know about money, where it had come from, where it had gone, and who had authorized its movement across state and international lines. Virginia answered their questions with the careful precision of someone who understood that every word could be used against her, revealing nothing while appearing to cooperate fully with their investigation. But cooperation was a luxury she could no longer afford. The same men who had once courted her favor now treated her as a toxic liability, someone whose very existence reminded the world of their business practices and vulnerabilities. Phone calls went unanswered, doors that had once opened automatically remained firmly closed, and the monthly envelopes of cash that had sustained her lifestyle simply stopped arriving. She was being erased from their world with the same ruthless efficiency they had used to eliminate Bugsy. The money began to disappear with frightening speed. Bank accounts were frozen by federal investigators, properties were seized for back taxes, and the jewelry and furs that had once seemed like permanent fixtures of her identity were sold off piece by piece to pay for lawyers and living expenses. Virginia watched her material wealth evaporate like morning mist, each loss a reminder of how precarious her position had always been beneath the surface glamour. By 1950, she was living in a modest apartment in Chicago, her beauty faded by stress and alcohol, her legendary temper now directed at process servers and tax collectors rather than rival gangsters' moles. The ears had become her most persistent enemy, demanding documentation for income she couldn't explain and expenses she couldn't justify. They calculated that she had spent over $5 million during her years with the syndicate, money that had supposedly come from gambling winnings and gifts from admirers, and they wanted every penny of it accounted for down to the last cent. The Kefauver Committee hearings in 1951 represented the final humiliation, a public stripping away of whatever dignity she had managed to preserve. Virginia sat at the witness table in a silver-blue mink stole and wide-brimmed hat, her defiance intact but brittle, facing senators who represented everything she had once thought she was above. They asked about her income, her relationships, her knowledge of criminal activities, and she answered with the sardonic wit that had once charmed dangerous men, but now only served to make her appear callous and unrepentant. "I'm a good gambler," she told them when they pressed her about the source of her wealth. "I win." The line would be quoted in newspapers across the country, transforming her into a symbol of everything that was wrong with America: greed, corruption, and moral decay wrapped in an expensive package. She became a cautionary tale told in living rooms and church halls, the woman who had sold her soul for material comfort and paid the ultimate price for her choices. The testimony made her unemployable in legitimate society and unwelcome in the underworld that had once embraced her. She was trapped between two worlds, belonging fully to neither, sustained only by the dwindling remains of money she had hidden in Swiss accounts and the fading hope that someday the heat would die down enough for her to rebuild her life. But heat, she was learning, was a permanent condition for people who had seen too much and survived too long. By 1952, Virginia Hill was preparing for exile, gathering the scattered remnants of her fortune and preparing to leave America forever. The country that had given her unprecedented opportunities for a woman of her background had also marked her for destruction, and she understood with crystalline clarity that staying would mean either prison or death. Europe beckoned as a refuge for Americans who had made themselves unwelcome at home, a place where money could still buy anonymity and distance from the consequences of past choices. As she boarded the ship that would carry her away from everything she had ever known, Virginia looked back at the New York skyline and felt no nostalgia for the life she was leaving behind. The American dream had become a nightmare, and she was finally waking up to discover that the price of her ambitions had been higher than she had ever imagined. The girl from Alabama who had dreamed of escaping poverty had achieved her goal, only to discover that some prisons were made of gold and some chains were forged from diamonds, and the most dangerous traps were the ones you built for yourself. Chapter 5: Resolution and Final Reflection. March 24, 1966. Thursday, Koppel, Austria. The snow fell softly on the Austrian countryside, muffling sound and softening the harsh edges of a world that had shown Virginia Hill no mercy for nearly 2 decades. She stood at the window of her modest house near Salzburg, watching the flakes drift past the glass like memories made visible, each one carrying with it some fragment of the life she had once lived. At 51, she was a ghost haunting her own existence, sustained by the fading remnants of wealth that had once seemed infinite and the bitter knowledge that she had survived longer than anyone had expected her to. The house was small, but comfortable, a far cry from the mansions and hotel suites that had once defined her world. She had bought it with the last of her Swiss bank account money, a final refuge where she could live quietly under the name Virginia Hauser, the wife of a former ski instructor who drank too much and resented her for not being as wealthy as he had hoped. Hans was away again, teaching rich tourists how to navigate the slopes, while Virginia navigated the much more treacherous terrain of her memories and regrets. The morning mail had brought another letter from the Internal Revenue Service, their pursuit of her as relentless as the snows that buried this alpine valley each winter. They wanted money she no longer had, documentation for expenses she could no longer justify, explanations for a lifestyle that had ended almost 20 years ago but continued to haunt her like a recurring nightmare. She set the letter aside, unopened, knowing it contained the same threats and demands that had driven her from country to country, always one step ahead of consequences that seemed to follow her like shadows. Virginia moved through the house with the careful precision of someone who had learned to conserve energy for the battles that mattered. Her beauty had faded gradually, worn away by stress and alcohol and the simple passage of time, but traces of her former magnetism remained in the way she carried herself, the arch of her eyebrow, the curve of her smile when she chose to deploy it. The mirror in the hallway showed her a woman she barely recognized, someone who looked like Virginia Hill's older sister, tired and disappointed by life's broken promises. She poured herself a glass of wine, though it was barely noon, and settled into the chair by the fireplace where she spent most of her days now. The bottle of sleeping pills sat on the side table next to a stack of letters she had been writing, but never sending, to her family in Alabama, to old friends who might still remember her, to the ghosts of men who had loved and betrayed her in equal measure. The pills had become her most faithful companions, promising the one thing that money had never been able to buy: peace. The memories came in waves now, triggered by the smallest stimuli, the scent of expensive perfume, the sound of dice rattling in a cup, the particular quality of light that fell through hotel windows at 3 a.m. She remembered the weight of Bugsy's arm around her waist as they stood in the desert planning their empire, the sound of his laughter echoing through the halls of the Flamingo, the way his eyes had looked when he talked about the future they would build together. He had been dead for 19 years, but she still felt his presence like a phantom limb, an ache that no amount of time or distance could heal. The European years had been a slow descent into irrelevance, marked by occasional appearances in sensational magazines and the persistent attention of journalists who wanted to resurrect the scandal of Virginia Hill for a new generation of readers. She had given a few interviews, selling pieces of her story for enough money to pay rent and buy groceries, but each telling had felt like another small death, another reduction of her complex life into tabloid headlines and moral lessons about the wages of sin. Her marriage to Hans had been an attempt to create normalcy, to become someone other than the infamous mob queen who had testified before Congress and fled into exile. But normalcy, she had discovered, was not something you could purchase or perform. It was a state of grace that required innocence she had lost long ago. Hans had married her hoping for access to hidden wealth and glamorous connections, and his disappointment when he discovered the truth had curdled into resentment and occasional cruelty. The isolation was the hardest part. Virginia had spent her adult life surrounded by people who wanted something from her: money, information, access, or simply the reflected glory of her notoriety. Now she was alone with her thoughts and memories, cut off from the family she had left behind and the world she had once ruled. Letters from Alabama came sporadically, filled with news of grandchildren she had never met and family gatherings she would never attend, reminders of the normal life she had rejected in favor of adventure and wealth. As afternoon faded into evening, Virginia made her decision with the same calm calculation that had once guided her through the dangerous waters of syndicate politics. She had been running for 20 years, always looking over her shoulder, always waiting for the knock on the door that would signal the end of her temporary safety. She was tired of running, tired of hiding, tired of being Virginia Hill and all the baggage that name carried. She wrote her final letters with careful deliberation, explaining nothing and apologizing for even less. To her brother Tommy, she wrote about the red clay roads of Alabama and how she sometimes dreamed of walking them again. To Hans, she left instructions about the house and a small insurance policy that would cover his immediate expenses. To the world, she left nothing but questions and the fading echo of a scandal that had once captivated a nation. The sleeping pills went down easily, washed down with the last of the wine, and Virginia settled back in her chair to wait for the peace that had eluded her for so long. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the world in pristine white, erasing footprints and tire tracks and all the other evidence of human passage. She thought about Bugsy one last time, imagining him waiting for her somewhere beyond the reach of federal investigators and syndicate justice, still handsome and charming, and full of impossible dreams. The house grew quiet as the pills took effect, the only sound the whisper of snow against the windows and the distant tolling of church bells in the village below. Virginia Hill closed her eyes and let herself drift away from the weight of memory and regret, finally free from the golden chains that had bound her to a life she had chosen but never truly owned. In the end, the scandalous life of Virginia Hill ended not with violence or headlines, but with the simple silence of snow falling on an empty house, covering the last traces of a woman who had dared to dream too big and paid the ultimate price for her ambitions. The morning would bring discovery and questions, newspaper stories and official investigations, but Virginia would be beyond their reach at last, having found in death the peace that wealth and power had never been able to provide. She had lived boldly and loved dangerously, had climbed higher than any woman of her background had a right to expect, and in the end, she had chosen her own exit from a stage that had never truly been hers to command.